In the Aftermath of World War II by Barry Collin, Elmore Vale, 2287. Narrated by Lex Marinos. As a little boy immediately after World War II, my neighbourhood was ever so slowly becoming a mixture of varying European ethnic groups who had escaped the horrors of war in Europe and were looking for safety and for peace. It was such a diverse range of cultures, languages and dress. My mother at the time worked in a wine bar and regaled us with stories of her new immigrant customers who, after a few wines, danced and laughed in celebration of their new freedoms. For her, these were happy and heady days. However, though the war had finished, some of the locals kept the war bubbling along just below the surface. Some Australians who suffered during that horrible time could not leave it behind, so there was still an undercurrent of hatred or, at the very least, social indifference against all things German and Japanese. As a side issue, people in discussion were also talking about a strange new phrase that was getting traction. That phrase was the Holocaust. I can recall that I wanted to know more, and I badgered my parents to explain just what people were talking about. Millions killed? That cannot be right. I really needed to know more. I remember the sit-down with my father and the half-baked explanation. I say half-baked because, just like the rest of the community at the time, he too was not fully aware of what was real and what was fantasy, about the trials and tribulations of those of the Jewish faith in Europe during those terrible times. He talked of people being killed in their millions and bodies supposedly being consumed in ovens. What madness was this? Today, we now know that the total number who died in the Holocaust has been estimated at 6 million. Dad also gave me a serious talk about a feud between two women further up the street just after the war that was subject to community debate and opinion. Firstly, there was a Mrs. Weber, who was an expat German who came to Australia in the 1930s, still with a heavy accent, and who was treated with disdain by a select few. After all, she was German, and some said she had to pay a price for that. Nearby too was a Mrs. Ahrens, the same age, and a Jewess. Mrs. Ahrens at the time had recently found out that some relatives of hers in Europe did not survive the Holocaust. Dad said that Mrs. Ahrens' tolerance for the German lady was nil, and it was reflected in her behaviour, which included shouting obscenities at her house and spitting on her front doorstep. At the time, I had a good friend by the name of David Engel, about my age, who was born in Australia but of German parents, who ran a corner shop in our suburb, albeit with limited English skills. I really enjoyed David's friendship, especially if we were going on an adventure, because, as an added bonus, he would just grab 2 ice creams out of the shop freezer as we left. David was of true Aryan stock, with the blondest of hair. Strangely, it was always adults, and not other children, asking me why I associated with David, questioning that I never really understood. Many people in our suburb boycotted the Engel shop because of the war. Sadly, I lost contact with David when we were 12 years old, and we went to different high schools. I missed my friend with a background somewhat different to mine. Beware if your name had an ethnic tone about it. People whose names had Polish, Hungarian, or other satellite country overtones were all treated with some sort of suspicion until their bona fides were tested by all and sundry. That must have been a miserable time for a lot of our European immigrants. Sadly, some Australians chose to see that ethnic diversity that my mother seemed to enjoy at her place of work as a threat to their own personal well-being. Yi Tai was a friendly old soul. He was our local Chinaman who shuffled down our street once a fortnight with a suitcase on either end of a wooden pole located on his shoulder, selling pots and pans among other things. He always wore a black suit in all weathers, and it was very shabby with a worn, shiny look about it. His black business shoes were down at the heels. He had a base shop situated nearby in the seedier part of town. A few years back, I came across an elderly gent who is sadly now passed on, who had personally known Yi Tai during World War II. Yi Tai had said something profound to him which I found of interest. When asked about the 1937 invasion of China by the Japanese and the implications of it all, Yi Tai laughed and stated that the Japanese would run out of bullets well before China ran out of people. I suspect that there is some Confucian type of logic in what he said. However, according to my father, despite his kindly nature and his age, Yi Tai was not immune to verbal attack. He was Asian, therefore by association had to be somehow involved with the Japanese. He was abused on occasions by the ill-informed and those hurt by the terrible times. As a young toddler, I was fascinated by Yi Tai. His perfectly shaped moon face always seemed to smile. Yi Tai at the time was the only Asian that I knew, and must have revered, for I know my mother told me that when he was due to come down our street, that I sat in the gutter and waited for him, just to say hello and to laugh at that special smile. Even at that age of 6, interaction with another ethnic group fascinated me, just as it did with my mother at her place of work. The end.